Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Landau, and I'm the Director of Public Affairs at AGU. I'm honored to introduce this panel who will provide helpful insight on an incredibly important issue, scientific integrity policies. We will leave a significant amount of time at the end of the presentation for questions, so please type them into the question box throughout the presentation. In recent years, an increasing number of scientists have found themselves involved in legal discussions about their work, their correspondence, and their public statements. To better prepare the scientific community for these challenges, AGU and the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund have put together a legal education program for the scientific community. The goal is to both give scientists a primer on the legal issues they face and to update them on the legal situations recently or currently making their way through the courts, which may impact them. The program includes webinars, events at AGU's fall meeting, and the ability to connect with attorneys who work on geoscience legal issues for help and advice. There's a link on the screen where you can go to watch past webinars from the program. At this year's fall meeting, we're hosting 3 events in this series, and we hope that you will join us for all 3. If you missed any of the events live, you may go back and watch it on demand on the fall meeting online platform. In addition, Augusta Wilson will share ways that you can get in touch directly with their legal team and other resources that they offer scientists. For today's event, we're fortunate to be able to hear from 2 panelists who will be able to discuss scientific integrity policies from 2 distinct perspectives. First, we'll hear from Augusta Wilson, who is a staff attorney for the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund and has helped scientists as they struggle with legal implications of scientific integrity policies. Next, we'll hear the firsthand account of Maria Caffrey, who is employed at the U.S. National Park Service and filed a whistleblower complaint against the agency in July of 2019. Thank you both so much for being here to discuss this important topic. Augusta, I will hand it over to you to begin the presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Augusta Wilson. I am a lawyer with the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about scientific integrity policies, and especially what they mean for scientists and how scientists can use them. So to start with, what are scientific integrity policies? There are a whole variety of institutions that have them. Most, if not all, of the federal scientific agencies have such policies. Many universities do, and also even some state agencies have actually adopted scientific policies. And what they are specific policies that are intended to provide a framework that ensures the integrity of the scientific activities that are carried out at, by, and for that institution. And so the first thing I want to do is talk through some of the most important subject areas that these policies cover. I should mention that we at CSLDF embarked on a project where we did a pretty substantial survey of scientific policies at the major federal scientific agencies, and also looked at a whole bunch of different universities, both in the US and in fact even abroad, and also looked at to the extent that state agencies in the US have these policies, looked at what those looked like. So what I am speaking from is that sense based on that survey of how these policies generally are structured, and the kinds of things that they tend to cover and the kinds of protections that they offer to scientists. So the first and perhaps and arguably most important subject area that almost all of the policies that we looked at cover is research misconduct. And I feel confident that almost everybody listening is familiar with that term and concept. But the way these policies tend to look at it is to frame research misconduct around 3 primary things. One is fabrication of data, fabrication of results, falsification, changing data results to falsify them in order to get a desired outcome, plagiarism. Those are the three main categories of research misconduct, and importantly, honest differences of opinion or honest error are not generally considered to be research misconduct pretty universally through agencies and universities. These policies are clear that honest error or differences of opinion do not constitute research misconduct and are not the kind of thing that's going to trigger any consequence under the scientific integrity policy. And this is the area that is most frequently covered, as I mentioned. This is the one that's closest to universal throughout all of these different kinds of institutions, is addressing research misconduct and making clear that that kind of misconduct is going to constitute a violation of the policy. The next one I want to mention is freedom from interference, and particularly freedom from political interference with a scientist's work, with scientific activities at the institution. This is in my opinion, an incredibly crucial area for these policies to cover. It is less universal than research misconduct. It's definitely something you see and many of the federal scientific agencies do address this. Many universities, from what we found, do not have policies and do not include this in their scientific integrity policies as something that constitutes a violation of scientific integrity. And in my opinion, that's an area for a huge amount of growth. And what I mean here, and what the policies that do cover this topic area try to address, is situations where a scientist's work is being subjected to censorship or suppression, a paper not being allowed to be published, a scientist not being allowed to offer congressional testimony or give an interview, a whole range of things, censorship, suppression for political reasons, direct editing or alteration of scientific products for political reasons. This is something that unfortunately happens from time to time. A superior at the organization directing or pressuring a scientist to alter their scientific work or alter their scientific findings, or someone at the organization threatening, intimidating, attempting to coerce a scientist into altering their findings themselves or not pursuing a particular course of scientific inquiry, for example. And these are the kinds of activities that these policies do often cover under the concept of freedom from political interference. Another important area is freedom of communication. So many of these policies are quite clear that part of scientific integrity, part of the integrity of the science done at the institution or on behalf of the institution, is that scientists be able to freely communicate with each other and with the public about their work. So making sure that scientists are free to disseminate information that's resulted from their work to the public and communicate openly with the press and speak freely about their work. Importantly, the right of a scientist to review communications from their institution that relate to their work, that are conveying their work, that are purporting to be about their work or written by them. The right of the scientist to review that and to correct it if there are any problems or mistakes is another category that these policies do often cover. Importantly, scientists' right to publicly express personal opinions as private citizens. And finally, including the concept that social media is now part of all of this, the online world, Twitter, blogs, all those various kinds of social media. This right of scientists to communicate freely includes their right to do so through social media. Next, professional development. Many institutions that have developed scientific integrity policies have included as part of their concept of scientific integrity that it's crucial that scientists have appropriate professional development, that scientists that work at the institution have that professional development. And this includes things like the ability to publish, the ability to attend professional conferences and present their work in various fora, the ability to participate in all different kinds of scientific societies, including as board members and things like that, the ability to participate in peer review, both internally within the institution and as external reviewers. The peer review process is a crucial part of scientific integrity. And finally, the ability to serve as editors for scientific journals. These are all categories of things that in many cases, an institution's scientific integrity policy does cover and make clear that if scientists are not being allowed to engage in these kinds of activities, are not being allowed this kind of appropriate professional development, that this is a violation of scientific integrity. So I just said a lot of words and walked through some details of what these policies look like. But I think one of the most helpful things is very often to take a step back and talk about a real world example of how these things actually play out and how a scientific integrity policy, like the ones that we're discussing, could become very relevant. And unfortunately, in the last few years, the examples have been extremely numerous. I'll take a quick moment to mention that we at CSLDF, along with the Sabin Center at Columbia Law School, have been keeping something called the Silencing Science Tracker, which was started in 2016 and has regrettably at this point documented hundreds of instances in which the current administration took anti-science actions, attempted to silence science in various ways. It's a really useful resource, and I encourage everyone to go check it out when you have time. And there you can find many, many examples, but I've just chosen one of the more recent to sort of illustrate the kinds of things that can happen where a scientific integrity policy really could be triggered and very useful potentially. So after the current coronavirus pandemic broke out, as everyone knows, there's been a huge push to develop a vaccine. And one of the things that happened recently is that the FDA proposed a set of stricter guidelines for approval of a coronavirus vaccine. And I'm sure that many of you have heard ongoing discussions about concern that the vaccine is, that if a vaccine is so rushed, it might not be effective, it might have side effects, it might not be trusted, etc. That an appropriate process for development of the vaccine is really crucial for its efficacy, even though we all want to have one as quickly as possible. So that's the context in which this happened, and the FDA proposed some stricter guidelines for going about approving a vaccine. And what happened after that is that the White House objected. And tried to push back on provisions of the guidelines FDA wanted to put in place that would have pushed approval past Election Day. This was clearly interference from the White House in this scientific process, in what really needs to pretty self-evidently be solidly science-based policy for political reasons, having everything to do with the timing of the election. And this is the kind of situation that a good scientific integrity policy at an institution like the FDA can actually be a useful tool, could potentially be a useful tool in addressing. And actually, fortunately, what happened in this circumstance is that the FDA pushed back and said, no, we're not, we are not tolerating this kind of political interference with what needs to be a science-based process. And so hopefully the fact of these scientific integrity principles being well established at FDA and a solid policy being in place helped the agency to resist this kind of political interference and to ensure the integrity of the science that the agency is doing. So to talk in a little bit more detail now about we talked about the sort of subject areas that scientific integrity policies tend to cover, the kinds of things that they prevent from happening or can prevent from happening. And I want to talk a little bit more about the logistics of making a claim under such a policy and how it works. Starting with who is covered under these policies. Generally speaking, again, we did a pretty broad survey, and generally what we found is that these policies are fairly broad in the way they structure who they apply to and who is covered under them. And so they generally, in many instances, they cover all of the institution's employees, including, in the case of federal scientific agencies, political appointees, those who are not career employees, but those who are there because of a political appointment. Those folks too are very often covered under these policies and required to abide by them. They also very often cover people who are not directly employed by the institution. So contractors, grantees, volunteers. In many instances, people like that who interact with an institution in one way and do science on behalf of an institution, engage in scientific activities on behalf of the institution, are covered by the scientific integrity policy, required to abide by its provisions. And often there are even just really broad catch-alls, making clear that that's the purpose. We want these principles to apply to anyone who is conducting scientific activities on behalf of our institution. So a related, although somewhat different question, that was who must abide by the principles laid out in the scientific integrity policy. Who can generally make claims under these policies? Who has the right to say, I have become aware of a violation of scientific integrity, of the scientific integrity policy, and I want to make a claim. I want to make a complaint. The policies are interestingly often silent on this particular issue, especially universities. We found in our survey that surprisingly, there's often simply no mention of this issue one way or the other, which means that they generally do not specifically require that somebody needs to be even affiliated with a particular institution to bring a claim that there's been a violation of that institution's scientific integrity policy. I think there are some outstanding questions about what would happen in that case if some third party from outside the institution, perhaps an outside interest group, filed a scientific integrity complaint at a federal agency or at a university. even though they would not be covered by the policy, and whether that would, necessarily hold up if they're, if they try to pursue that claim actually into court, I think is a little bit of an open question. But suffice it to say that many of these policies certainly don't explicitly rule out the possibility that that kind of situation could arise, a third party making a claim under a scientific integrity policy, making a complaint. That said, many of the policies do have some explicit provisions protecting the confidentiality of parties involved in a scientific integrity complaint, which is, hopefully some comfort both to those who might think they are aware of a violation of scientific integrity and be concerned about repercussions of making a complaint, and to those who might be the subject of a scientific integrity complaint. Confidentiality for all parties is certainly something that many of these policies are very clear on and stake out as a pretty important issue. I'll mention briefly that it's often possible to make a claim anonymously, even if that's what somebody wants to do, although that can make investigating the claim a lot more difficult. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, but if anonymity is really a concern, in many cases, it can be maintained. Let's talk a little bit about the details of the actual process for making a claim. Imagining that I'm someone who believes I'm aware of a scientific integrity violation, and I want to bring it to my institution's attention. I want to make a complaint pursuant to the scientific integrity policy. How do I do that? There is some variation in the policies at the whole different range of institutions in terms of exactly how this works, but most often there's going to be some kind of official within the institution, a scientific integrity officer or something similar. In the case of an academic institution, it's often a dean, the most appropriate dean, who is designated as the person to whom complaints should be made. That's generally what it's going to look like. There's some kind of official who's put in charge of handling this, and that's the person that you make the complaint to. There's a separate route that often is available, which is to go through what is intended to be an independent office, in the case of federal agencies, that is, of the Inspector General. Inspector General's offices can frequently also receive these kinds of complaints, although taking that route means sort of following a whole different set of procedures, because then you're in the Inspector General's office and they have sort of their own way of doing things. The complaint generally needs to be in writing, and it's generally going to need to include at least a basic description of what is alleged to have happened and how it was a violation of scientific integrity. One key thing to be aware of is that in some cases there are time limits. There are statutes of limitations, in effect, on how long someone has after becoming aware of a potential violation of scientific integrity to file a complaint. So that is something that's important to think about if you are someone who believes you're aware of a violation. It's important to know whether or not there's a clock ticking on how long you have to file a complaint. In some cases there isn't, but in some cases there is, depending on what the institution is that we're dealing with. So what's going to happen after a complaint is actually filed? Usually, most frequently, that scientific integrity officer or official that I was referring to, whoever that is within the specific institution, is going to be responsible for overseeing an investigation of the complaint, of the and of the underlying facts. So some of the things that commonly happen as part of that investigation are going to be the formation of a panel that's going to conduct an investigation, conduct interviews, review evidence, interviews with the parties involved, and in some cases, people who might be relevant witnesses. And then very frequently what the policies call for is for that panel to issue a written report of their findings, what they looked at, how they proceeded, and what their conclusion is. And frequently also, it's important to note that the person who has been accused of committing a violation of scientific integrity is going to have a right to review those reports and comment on them, provide feedback, and have the right for that to be part of the official record and for that to be reviewed. So after the end of an investigation, generally there's going to be a written decision by a deciding official, very often that scientific integrity officer, whoever is overseeing the whole process. And in some cases, the policies actually explicitly give a right for someone who's accused to have a reconsideration or an appeal of the final decision. Most of the policies don't contain that many specifics about what exactly is going to happen if, in fact, misconduct is found, a violation of scientific integrity is found, which is, again, I think an important failing, because it leaves a lot open. Generally, it's left to the deciding official of some kind to determine what sort of penalty is appropriate. Talking a little bit about what we know about how federal agencies in particular, have handled these claims in the past. Many of them make anonymized summaries of complaints and the resolutions of those complaints available online. And so people can go and see how each individual specific situation was resolved. But some overarching trends, most institutions tend to really favor early intervention in a situation where there's believed to be a violation of scientific integrity, and sort of a mediation type approach, informal resolution, as opposed to formal investigation and penalties, etc. Very frequently these situations get resolved as a result of that, without an explicit finding of wrongdoing. And one of the things that we found in our overall survey is that probably for institutional reasons, there is a tendency to label many of the situations that generate complaints as not a scientific integrity violation, but simply a difference of opinion, or as a personnel or policy issue. And that's another area in which there's a great deal of room for improvement, not even necessarily in the wording of the policies, but in the way that they are enforced. A few quick tips on what to do if you are a scientist who believes that you're aware of a violation of scientific integrity. Document it. Good records and good notes are keys. As I mentioned earlier, being mindful of deadlines for reporting. It can be really useful to consider consulting trusted colleagues in your organization to gauge how other people are responding to the situation, and how much support or not you find among them for taking action. If you are the subject of an accusation, if you're accused of violating scientific integrity, most important things to do are to not panic, to not ignore it, to document it, and to get in touch with someone who can help you and represent your interests. I'll take a moment to mention here that we at CSLDF offer free and completely confidential consultations to scientists, and in many cases, continuing pro bono legal support for scientists. And if you are a scientist who's facing this kind of situation, either believes that you are aware of a scientific integrity violation or have been accused of a scientific integrity violation, please do not hesitate to contact us to get support. And along those lines, I will note very briefly that we have a couple of resources available for free download on our website, written resources for scientists that touch on some of the issues that I've talked about in this presentation, including guides to scientific integrity policies at a number of the key federal scientific integrity agencies and also at universities. So those are available, and I hope that you will go check them out. And last but not least, this is my contact information. And so again, for any scientist who has a specific individual question that you would like to talk through, please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you all very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Caffrey, and I formerly worked for the National Park Service as a partner with them. My role at the National Park Service was to advise them on the impacts of climate change, particularly in the coastal zone. And so I worked there for several years, almost 8 years. And during that time, it was very fulfilling. It was a great role. But what I'm here to talk to you about today is about something that happened to me as I was preparing to release one particular report that I have up on the screen right here. And that was something that has been reported in the press fairly extensively. It's been a really difficult time for me. And so I hope by sharing this story, I can give you an example of the kind of things that scientists are facing right now as far as censorship and suppression of their work. So as I mentioned, this sea level rise and storm surge project that I was leading was a large project. It started in 2013, and one of the goals of it was to produce a report that would allow us to compare the impacts of sea level rise and storm surge for 118 coastal park units. This was really important because it provided a consistent methodology, used the latest climate change scenarios at that time, and it allowed us to compare between parks across the whole national park system. And it was being used in other reports as well. So the report was funded, or the project was funded, excuse me, in 2013. I handed in my first draft of the report in 2016. That's when it was due. And it went through the usual kind of peer review that I had always experienced under the federal government, which was lengthy and slow. But then in 2017, the Trump administration happened. And almost overnight, my whole world shifted. The report was sitting there ready to go. I had it just ready to push out. And at that point, I reached out to one of my supervisors at the National Park Service to ask about next steps. First red flag in that was that she asked me to start including people in this report who had not had an active part in writing it. I had wrote it all by myself, but suddenly they wanted to add people within the federal system that hadn't been writing it. So in January 2017, Donald Trump enters office, and around that time, I emailed the head of the Climate Change Response Program. These are all emails that are publicly available through a Freedom of Information Act request. And as you can see from this communication, the head of the Climate Change Program was telling me that I should await guidance on their messaging around their work. I should have taken that as a red flag. At the time, I trusted my colleagues. I expected that this was just going to be a standard check, but it wasn't. Then the report was delayed several times over. It was initially meant to be released in April. I was given a rather lame excuse why that couldn't happen. Then it was going to be released in September 15th, as you see in this email right here. But then with Hurricane Harvey making its way through the Gulf, they felt that perhaps they would hold off on releasing the report. So at this point, the report is 9 months, almost 9 months of just languishing. Finished the draft in 2016, finished reviews January 2017, just sitting there. So at that point, it was puzzling, but I was also kind of consumed with another project, which was I was going on maternity leave. And so while I was on maternity leave in early 2018, what I didn't realize was that there were these communications occurring between my colleagues while I wasn't in the office. The head of the climate change program was talking to other people who expressed concern about the fact that I had used terms referring to climate change being anthropogenic climate change, human-caused climate change. And so while I was out, I was contacted by a very good colleague of mine, Patrick Gonzales, who raised the flag for me that they were editing my report in my absence to take out that humans were the cause of climate change. And so this slide is just one example of the kind of edits that they were trying to make. Initially, I was told that these edits were to take out the word anthropogenic climate change because the word anthropogenic was too technical a term. I said, no problem, let's just change it to human-caused climate change. But that's when cards were laid on the table and I was told that no, that wouldn't be acceptable either. I discussed that climate change was caused by humans in several places, such as the one below, because I had to explain the methods behind my work. I had to explain why I had 4 different climate change scenarios that I was discussing. And so they wanted to strip the report of anything that mentioned that humans could be the cause of this. So I refused the edits, and I told my supervisors that I felt that this was a violation of the scientific integrity policies that were currently on the books at the National Park Service. I was threatened. I was told that if I did not allow them to make these edits, then they would publish it without my name on it, or perhaps not even publish it at all. So that would be a huge gap on my CV, of course, and it would be depriving parks of the information that they need to plan. So I stood my ground, and with the help of the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, I filed various scientific integrity complaints. At the same time, there was a reporter who had been following my work. She had initially interviewed me in 2013 at the launch of this project. And so she had circled back to ask why the report wasn't out yet. I said I wasn't allowed to speak about it. And so she filed this Freedom of Information Act request to get drafts of the report. I guess she smelt that something was not quite right in this process. And so this is the first of her articles that came out in April 2018, saying that the National Park Service is withholding this report because they want to remove these terms. Because that was in the press, I believe that that was enough to pressure my colleagues to release the report. And they released it uncensored, which at the time felt like a tremendous victory. However, it wasn't quite the victory I'd hoped it to be. I was told that because the National Park Service had put those terms back into my report, that there was no longer a violation of the scientific integrity policy. Basically, their hand had been caught in the cookie jar here. And because they put the cookie back, then there was no harm, no foul. But of course, there was a tremendous impact to my career. It soured my relationship with everybody up the chain with me. I had to switch supervisors. I had to take a temporary demotion to an intern level so that I could work with a new supervisor. And then once my internship came to an end in February 2019, my supervisor gave me glowing reviews. I was told that his intention was to renew me with full funding in this new division. Instead, when he put that request into a senior person at the National Park Service, he was told that actually there would be no funding available for me. which was a surprise. We completely expected, based on my performance for that year, that I would be renewed. And so I felt bad that at such short notice, my colleagues were going to be left with a workload. And so I offered to come back as a volunteer and continue my work. But I was told that I wouldn't even be allowed to come back as a volunteer. So the excuse that they didn't have the funds to renew me kind of fell apart at that point. It was very clear that I was being pushed out. In July 2019, again, with the help of the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, we filed a whistleblower complaint relating to my treatment at the National Park Service. And I testified to Congress about the need for greater scientific integrity laws. This has been really, really difficult for me and my family to have my career taken away from me like this. It's been nearly impossible to find a new job. And so I have been unemployed essentially since I lost my job. And I've been told by multiple people that that they feel that by hiring me, it would look like a political move. And so that's it. I feel very blacklisted for simply choosing to stand up for the science, for speaking out against what was happening at the National Park Service. And so, yes, that's my story. And so by sharing this, I hope that, others can learn from this. I think one of the key things we need to learn is that we need stronger scientific integrity laws. If you are someone who is ever going through this, you should make sure to document everything as it unravels. And just beware of how government agencies can change so quickly and how their philosophies can shift. These were all colleagues who, during the Obama administration, were excellent colleagues, that none of whom would question the science behind climate change, that were passionate about their jobs. Indeed, if you're the head of a climate change program, of course you care about the impact of climate change on your program, but at the same time, you also care about the people that you work with. And perhaps if there is a change in politics whereby someone might want to shut down your department, maybe you'd rather save your department than, risk speaking the truth about the impact of climate change. Government censorship is a serious problem right now, one that I hope we can resolve. We need better rules for protecting people who, like me, as a partner at the National Park Service, so I don't really fall into some of the federal protections for full federal employees. We need to change the scientific integrity laws so that this excuse of, well, if you change the words back, then you're not going to get into any trouble. That doesn't make any sense to me. And so we need to think a lot more carefully as we look ahead to the Biden administration about what kind of changes we can make so that what happened to me never happens to any other scientist again. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this session today. We really appreciate it. I hope it's been useful and informative for everyone. And my name is Augusta Wilson, and you just saw some substantive presentation earlier. And what I'm going to do now is just take a couple of questions that have come in from the session. And the first one that I have is, to what extent is open access to science included in scientific integrity policies? And if it isn't, should open access be included in these policies moving into the future? And that's a terrific question. So I'll start first by saying I am not aware off the top of my head of any scientific integrity policies that I've seen that directly deal with open access issues, that, that tackle those really explicitly. But that said, quite a number of policies, I know that, for example, the EPA is an agency whose policy is a good example of one that does talk about, in more general terms, the importance of scientific information being widely available to the public in a timely way. And to some degree, there is a discussion in some policies about the importance of the fora in which that information is made available being widely accessible and being public. So some of them talk, for instance, about the importance of scientific information and even information about how a particular institution, an agency, or a university is handling scientific integrity claims being made widely available, being made available online on a publicly accessible website and things like that. So some of those types of issues are at least implicitly touched upon in some of these policies. And I definitely think that that forms a good building block for, perhaps addressing more explicitly some open access issues. And I know that is, a really important and active and ongoing discussion in the scientific community as a whole. And I personally think that it probably would be a good idea for these policies to start to address that a little bit and talk about the importance of making sure, particularly in the case of a public agency, that the scientific information is made available in an open way. I think that's, from the standpoint of federal agencies, at least, which, as you guys know from the presentation, we took a close look at. I think a lot of that information is, already made available in an open access way. You're not dealing with paywalls and things like that. So this might be an issue that, for example, universities need to think more carefully about addressing in their policies. But I think it's a great question, and certainly points out that that's an important area that I'm not sure that the drafters of these policies have so far done a huge amount of thinking about. But I'm glad you brought it up. And so let's see. Let's see if there are any other questions that have come in. I can address one here. What should my first course of action be if I think I see a scientific integrity violation at my institution? Also a great question. So my advice to a scientist who finds themselves in that situation, believes that they become aware of something that's a violation of scientific integrity policy. And the first thing I would do is advise them to take good notes. Documentation can be very, very helpful in terms of having a good record of the timing of events, what happened, what you were aware of, and when. The second thing that I would advise people at least consider is, talking with other trusted colleagues to sort of gauge how others read the situation. And it might be necessary to sort of do that in a way that maintains confidentiality for the person or people you are talking about. One thing that I'm not sure we got a chance to touch on too much in the actual presentation is that many of the policies that exist make very, very plain, as is very reasonable, I think, that confidentiality is crucial in all of these processes and in the whole process of reporting and investigating a claim of scientific integrity. So I'm saying, it can be useful to gauge, gauge how other colleagues sort of see the situation, whether others also feel that it is a violation. And that is true, but in doing that, you definitely do need to make sure to be taking confidentiality concerns into account. So perhaps discussing things in a way that keeps people anonymous, etc. But it can be very helpful to sort of, do a sanity check before you proceed. The third thing that I would say is making sure that you've taken stock of what the reporting options are. So as I touched on earlier in the presentation, most of the time, there is going to be at your institution, whether that's a university or an agency, there's going to be an official who is designated to be the person who handles these kinds of complaints. In the case of many agencies, there's someone who is called something very close to the scientific integrity officer or the scientific integrity official. At universities, for example, very often there's a particular dean who's been designated to handle these kinds of issues. And, in reference to what I was discussing about, sort of doing an initial sanity check and also keeping confidentiality concerns in mind, very often those offices not only are willing to, but highly encourage people to come to them on an unofficial basis to discuss an issue like this, and to help talk through and understand whether what is going on here really may be a violation of scientific integrity or not. And that can be an incredibly useful resource and an incredibly useful way to, to deal with those concerns. Making sure that you maintain confidentiality and you handle things appropriately. So those kinds of offices, unofficial conversations can be a very, very useful resource as a way to start. And the last thing that I would mention is that folks can always feel very free to reach out to us at Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. We offer free and confidential consultations and are very happy to be a resource to scientists who are dealing with these kinds of questions. And we can help to fill that same kind of function, help talk you through it, help you think through whether this, whether it makes sense to proceed and sort of report up further, what the consequences of that might be, and again, we do that completely confidentially, so we can help you sort of maintain on that front. So I hope that's a helpful framing for that question. One other question that I will be happy to talk through that I see here. If something happened with a staff person who then leaves the agency, is there still any recourse for that issue? That's also a great question. I think the answer is there may be. Most of the policies that I'm aware of tend to focus on those who are actively working at or with an agency or other institution. That said, so the policy may not apply quite as strongly to someone who is no longer there or no longer, actively working with the agency or other institutions. So certain kinds of responses like demotions or removal from a project, things like that. may not be possible if the person who's alleged to have violated the policy is no longer there. But other kinds of recourse may not only be possible, but appropriate, such as retracting certain research. If it's found that there was some kind of violation, that there was an issue of fabrication or plagiarism related to that research, might be not only very possible, but completely appropriate, even though the person at issue is no longer there. So there absolutely are circumstances in which I think it might be very reasonable to pursue a claim through one of these policies, even if the person at issue is no longer with the institution. And last but certainly not least here, last question: if I don't think my agency is going to take my complaint seriously, what can I do? Yeah, that's unfortunately a very real question that a lot of scientists have struggled with and continue to. I know that you all just heard earlier from Dr. Caffrey, who talked about her experience. And this is unfortunately something that scientists have faced, particularly in the last few years, a feeling that I'm very unlikely to be successful, to get the outcome that I'm hoping for in bringing a scientific integrity complaint. And I guess what I would say about that is that a huge amount of this, as very much illustrated by Dr. Caffrey's story, is it comes down to a deeply personal decision. I can tell you that I personally have worked with scientists who feel both ways. Scientists who feel that I believe that this is an incredibly important issue. I feel that I have seen a violation or experienced a violation that's really important, and I feel that I need to speak out, and I need to stand up and try to correct this. And I feel that I need to do that, even if I know that there's a good chance that my institution, my agency, my employer is not going to respond very favorably to the complaint that I'm going to make. The principle is that crucial, and I'm willing to sort of pay a certain level of personal price to do that. I've worked with other scientists, and I think this is completely reasonable as well, who have said, my job is very important to me. I want to continue in my role with my employer, my agency, my university, whatever it might be. I don't see much chance of success, and on balance, I need to. I need to think about maintaining my position, and that's perfectly reasonable. I would say again, that is exactly the kind of thing that we at CSLDF are very happy to help people talk through. I was talking earlier a little bit about the importance of sort of taking stock before you dive into this, understanding what the avenues are, understanding what the consequences may be and are likely to be. So I would highly encourage anybody who's any scientist who's wrestling with that kind of question, to reach out to us, and we would be very, very happy to talk it through with you, try to help you weigh the pros and cons of a decision to report or not report, move forward or not move forward. It's also, again, a situation where taking confidentiality concerns into consideration, consultation with trusted colleagues can be very, very useful, because, others' experience and others' impressions can really help you to sort of gauge how things are are potentially likely to play out. So that's the kind of thing that I would really encourage scientists to do. But if they're facing a question like this. So I want to thank everyone again very much for your attention, for listening to the presentation, and for your questions. I hope that it's provided some useful information, and I hope everybody has a very enjoyable and productive conference. Thank you so much.